Introduction: The Moscow Static. Welcome to Synapse Daily. It is 1965.
The air in Moscow is thick with the scent of cheap Belomorkanal tobacco and the cold, invisible static of the space race. While the Americans are looking at the stars, dreaming of the moon, a man named Viktor Glushkov is looking at a chalkboard in Kiev.
He isn't dreaming of rockets.
He is dreaming of something far more dangerous, far more radical, a machine that thinks for the state. Imagine a world where every loaf of bread, every steel girder, and every ruble is managed by a digital god.
This is the story of OGAS.
The Soviet internet that was meant to save communism, but was ultimately strangled by the very humans it was designed to serve.
Chapter 1: The Invisible Crisis, the Entropy of Empire.
By the mid-1960s, the Soviet Union was a titan, but it was a titan drowning in its own size. The command economy had become a mathematical nightmare that no human brain could solve.
The logistics of chaos: to understand the crisis, you have to understand the scale.
In a capitalist market, prices adjust themselves through supply and demand. In the USSR, prices were decided by men in suits. To plan the production of a single common nail, a bureaucrat in Moscow had to account for the iron ore mined in the Urals, the coal processed in Siberia, the electricity generated in the Volga, and the transport trains running through Ukraine. One mistake, just one, could cause a ripple effect. If a factory in Minsk didn't get its rubber seals on time, the tractor factory in Volgograd stopped. If the tractors stopped, the grain in Kazakhstan rotted in the fields.
By 1965, the Soviet economy was producing 12 million distinct types of goods. The number of mathematical links between these products was in the trillions.
The information explosion: Soviet mathematicians made a terrifying calculation. They called it the information explosion. They estimated that if the economy continued to grow at its current pace, the complexity of planning would increase by the square of the output.
By 1980, the math suggested that the entire Soviet population would need to be employed as bureaucrats just to keep the paperwork moving. Imagine that.
Every man, woman, and child, sitting at a desk, filling out forms, just to decide how many socks should be sent to Vladivostok.
The system was reaching entropy. It was a clockwork machine that was grinding its gears into dust. Could a machine solve what a million bureaucrats could not? Glushkov believed it could. But he wasn't just suggesting a calculator. He was suggesting an evolution. Chapter 2: The Architect of the Digital Soul, the Prophet of Cybernetics. Enter Viktor Mikhailovich Glushkov. He wasn't just a mathematician, he was a pioneer of cybernetics, the science of control and communication. In the early days of the USSR, cybernetics was denounced as a bourgeois pseudoscience, a tool of capitalists to enslave the working class. But Glushkov changed that. He didn't want a better calculator, he wanted a global nervous system. He called it OGAS, the All-State Automated System for the Gathering and Processing of Information. The three-layered pyramid: Glushkov's vision was a masterpiece of engineering. He envisioned a pyramid made of silicon, copper, and light. The foundation: 20,000 local nodes. Every factory, every farm, every workshop across 11 time zones would have a terminal. They would record every bolt produced, every hour worked, and every resource used in real time. No more lying about quotas. No more lost shipments. The bridge: 200 regional centers. These would be the massive data hubs located in major cities like Kiev, Tashkent, and Leningrad. They would filter the local data, looking for patterns of waste or opportunity. The brain: one central hub in Moscow. This was the main computing center. It would run a massive, nationwide model of the economy. It would be a digital twin of the entire Soviet Union, optimizing the nation's pulse every single millisecond. How would it feel to live in this world? Imagine a factory manager in 1965. Instead of waiting weeks for a telegram from Moscow, he looks at a glowing screen. The screen tells him exactly what the nation needs today. The machine knows the weather, the transport delays, and the consumer demand. Glushkov wanted to turn the state into a living organism. Chapter 3: The Cashless Ghost, the Death of the Ruble. Perhaps Glushkov's most radical and most dangerous proposal was the elimination of paper money. Think about the year, 1965.
The world was still decades away from the first credit card being used globally.
Bitcoin was science fiction. Yet, Glushkov was proposing a cashless society. He called them electronic receipts.
The logic of digital justice: in Glushkov's world, money was the root of corruption. It could be stolen, hidden, or used to bribe officials. He wanted to replace it with a digital ledger. When a worker performed a task, the computer would log the value.
Their digital balance would update instantly.
They could spend this at the state store, where the transaction would be recorded by the network.
The end of the black market. This wasn't just about efficiency, it was about total transparency. If every ruble was a digital bit, you couldn't have a shadow economy. You couldn't have a gray market for Western blue jeans or black market meat.
It was pure mathematical justice.
The great question, but here is the question that haunts historians to this day: if the logic was perfect, why did the humans say no? If you could eliminate poverty and corruption with a line of code, why wouldn't you?
The answer lies not in the hardware, but in the heart of the beast.
Chapter 4: The Assassination of Progress, the Bureaucratic Coup.
The tragedy of OGAS wasn't a technical failure.
The BESM-6 computers were fast enough. The engineers were brilliant enough. The failure was a human betrayal.
The fear of the ministers: when Glushkov presented his plan to the Politburo, the room went cold.
The Ministry of Finance, led by Vasily Garbuzov, realized something terrifying: if the computer is always right, the minister is irrelevant. If a machine in Kiev can decide where the steel goes more accurately than a human in Moscow, why do we need the human? The bureaucrats realized that OGAS would bring transparency. And in a system built on secrets, transparency is a death sentence. The un-Marxist machine, they couldn't just say they were afraid of losing their jobs.
So, they fought dirty. They whispered in the ears of the Kremlin leaders. They told Leonid Brezhnev that the machine was un-Marxist. They argued that it would take power away from the party and give it to the technocrats.
They used a classic tactic: bureaucratic sabotage.
In 1970, the Ministry of Finance made sure the funding for the unified network was slashed. Instead of a single, powerful state brain, they allowed each ministry to buy its own, incompatible computers. They created digital silos.
The death of a dream. By the early 1970s, Glushkov's dream was dead.
The Soviet Internet was reduced to a series of glorified accounting machines that couldn't talk to each other. The USSR had chosen to stay in the age of paper because paper could be manipulated. Paper could be used to hide the truth.
Glushkov reportedly said, "The first person to understand the computer's power is the one who will use it to destroy his rivals." He was right.
The bureaucrats used the computer to count their chairs, while the empire's foundation began to crumble.
Chapter 5: The Western Mirror, ARPANET vs. OGAS. While Glushkov was pleading with the Kremlin, across the Atlantic, another digital revolution was brewing.
But the American approach was the photographic negative of the Soviet one. In the US, the project was called ARPANET.
Centralization versus decentralization. The Soviet OGAS was designed as a top-down hierarchy.
It was meant to consolidate power into a single, perfect brain in Moscow.
The Americans, driven by the fear of a nuclear strike, wanted the exact opposite.
They wanted a decentralized network.
If one city was vaporized by a Soviet missile, the rest of the network had to survive.
The motivation gap. Here is the irony that historians often miss: the US built the internet for war, while the USSR tried to build it for peace, or at least, for economic stability. The US military funded ARPANET because they needed a communication system that couldn't be killed.
Glushkov wanted a system that would make life better for the common worker. The outcome: because the American network was decentralized, it was messy.
It allowed for individual creativity, private emails, and eventually, the World Wide Web. Because the Soviet network was centralized, it was a target for bureaucrats.
By trying to control everything from the center, the Soviet Union ensured that if the center failed, the whole project died. Chapter 6: A Day in the Life of a Cybernetics Subject.
To understand the magnitude of what was lost, we have to step out of the labs and into the streets of Kiev or Moscow in an alternate 1975, a world where OGAS succeeded. The morning routine: imagine a factory worker named Yuri. In our timeline, Yuri spends 3 hours a week standing in lines for basic goods. In the OGAS timeline, Yuri wakes up and checks a small terminal in his apartment. The network has already calculated that his neighborhood needs fresh milk. The delivery was optimized by a regional hub at 4 a.m. The paperless factory: at the factory, Yuri doesn't fill out manual logs. Every movement of the assembly line is captured by sensors. The foundation level of the network, those 20,000 nodes, is pulse-checking the factory's health. If a machine breaks, the network automatically redirects spare parts from a warehouse 3 cities away before the manager even picks up the phone. The social credit of the 60s: Yuri is paid in digital credits. There is no physical money in his pocket. This creates a strange sense of mathematical zen. There is no inflation because the computer balances the supply of goods with the supply of credits perfectly. But there is a price: the state knows everything. Every purchase, every calorie, every movement is a data point. OGAS wasn't just an internet, it was a total surveillance economy. Chapter 7: The BSM-6, the Iron King of Soviet Computing. We cannot talk about OGAS without talking about the iron. The BSM-6 was the crown jewel of Soviet hardware. It was the first Soviet supercomputer to reach 1 million operations per second. Architecture of a giant, the BSM-6 was a beast of its time. It used a 48-bit word length and featured a sophisticated paged memory system that was ahead of many Western designs. It was the first machine to use high-speed transistors and a pipeline architecture, allowing it to process multiple instructions at once. The cooling problem: these machines generated immense heat. Walking into a BSM-6 data center was like walking into a sauna filled with the smell of ozone and hot metal. Engineers had to work in shifts just to keep the liquid cooling systems from failing. The tragedy of compatibility: the real technical heartbreak wasn't the BSM-6 itself, it was what came after. Instead of evolving the BSM-6, the Soviet leadership later ordered engineers to simply copy the IBM 360 architecture. This forced the greatest minds in the USSR to stop innovating and start reverse engineering stolen Western parts. It was the moment the Soviet Union admitted it could no longer lead the digital race. Chapter 8: Cyberfeminism and the Soviet Office. One of the most overlooked aspects of the OGAS era was how it changed the role of women in the Soviet Union. In the 1960s, computing was not yet a bro culture like it became in Silicon Valley. The women of the keyboards: the vast majority of data entry, programming, and system maintenance for the early OGAS nodes was performed by women. They were the human interfaces of the Soviet Internet. While men in the Politburo argued about Marxist theory, thousands of female mathematicians and engineers were actually building the code. The rise of the technocrat: this created a new class of Soviet citizens. They weren't farmers and they weren't soldiers, they were information workers. Glushkov's dream of a paperless office would have empowered this class, potentially creating a middle class that could have reformed the USSR from the inside. When the project was defunded, this entire generation of female expertise was pushed back into traditional, stagnant roles. Chapter 9: The Ghost in the Machine, Early Soviet AI. Was OGAS the father of modern AI? Glushkov believed in artificial intellect. He didn't just want a network, he wanted a system that could learn from the data. The feedback loop: in Chapter 1, we talked about entropy. Glushkov's AI was meant to fight entropy through feedback loops. If the system saw that a certain type of steel was constantly breaking, the AI would automatically change the chemical formula for the next batch. The philosophical terror: this is where it gets spooky. Glushkov began to talk about a collective intelligence. He hypothesized that as the network grew, it would develop a form of consciousness, a way of knowing what the Soviet people needed before they even knew it themselves. The prediction: Glushkov once predicted that by the 21st century, computers would be smaller than a pack of cigarettes and would contain all the knowledge of the world. He was laughed at. Today, we call that a smartphone. He saw the ghost in the machine 60 years ago, but his masters were too afraid of the ghost to let it speak.
Chapter 10: The Fall of the Paper Empire, The Cost of Silence. By the mid-1980s, the information explosion that Glushkov had warned about finally detonated. The Soviet Union didn't collapse because of a lack of missiles, it collapsed because it was blind. The ledger of lies, without a unified network like OGAS, the Soviet economy became a house of mirrors. Factory managers, terrified of missing quotas, began to lie on their paper reports. They claimed to produce 10,000 tractors when they only produced 5,000. Because there was no digital eye, the nodes, to verify the data in real time, the Kremlin based its entire national budget on fictional numbers. The entropy death. While the US was entering the era of the personal computer and the early internet, Soviet bureaucrats were still using wooden abacuses and carbon paper. The command economy had become so complex that it took longer to plan a product than it did to build it. By the time Mikhail Gorbachev took power, the dead hand of the bureaucracy had already strangled the economy. Glushkov's ghost was laughing from the grave. The empire had chosen the human way, and the humans had lighted into extinction. Chapter 11: Glushkov's Final Warning, The Death of a Prophet. Viktor Glushkov died in 1982, just as the Soviet Union began its final downward spiral. In his final days, he was a frustrated man. He spent his last hours in a hospital bed, dictating his memoirs to his daughter. The letter to the future. Glushkov knew the end was coming. He wrote that the rejection of OGAS was the greatest mistake of the century. He warned that without a digital nervous system, the Soviet Union would lose its ability to perceive reality. He wasn't just talking about math, he was talking about truth. He predicted that the West would eventually build exactly what he proposed, but they would use it for consumption rather than coordination. He saw a future where every human was a data point, but instead of being used to ensure everyone had bread, it would be used to sell them things they didn't need. Chapter 12: Modern China and the Neo-OGAS, The Dream Reborn? Is Glushkov's dream truly dead? If you look at modern China, the answer is a resounding no. The digital dragon. Today, China's social credit system and its massive state-controlled data networks are, in many ways, the spiritual successor to OGAS. They have the hardware Glushkov lacked. They have the fiber optics, the 5G, and the AI. They are attempting the ultimate cybernetic experiment. Can you have a market economy with a digital command center? The terrifying success. Unlike the Soviet ministers of 1965, the modern state has embraced the machine. They use AI to predict crop yields, manage traffic, and most controversially, monitor the loyalty of the population. Glushkov wanted a machine to manage things. Modern states are using it to manage people. The mathematical justice Glushkov promised has turned into algorithmic control. Chapter 13: Conclusion, The Legacy of Synapse Daily. As we close this chapter of Synapse Daily, we have to ask ourselves, who really won the digital war? We often think of the internet as a tool of freedom, a decentralized gift from the West. But look at our world today. We are managed by algorithms. Our prices are set by the cloud. Our desires are predicted by neural networks. The cybernetic mirror. Glushkov's vision wasn't wrong, it was just early. We are currently living in a global OGAS. The only difference is that it isn't run by the Soviet state, it's run by massive corporations and invisible codes. The final question: the USSR fell because it feared the truth that data reveals. Today, we have all the data in the world, but do we have the wisdom to use it? Or are we just the new bureaucrats, filling out digital forms while our own system reaches its own version of entropy? The Soviet internet was a dream of a world without waste, without greed, and without error. It was a dream killed by the very thing it tried to perfect: humanity. Thank you for listening to this deep dive on Synapse Daily. If you found this journey through the silicon graveyards of the Cold War fascinating, make sure to subscribe and share. Like this video if you learned something new. Comment your thoughts below and subscribe for more fascinating stories.